questions. So today I'm answering the question, what is the difference between trauma, the terms trauma, PTSD, and complex PTSD or c-PTSD? So that's what we're going to be talking about today, about what each of those terms mean, because they do mean very different things. And then I'll kind of go into what the diagnostic criteria is for PTSD, and then what some of the diagnostic criteria for complex PTSD are, and why that's a new diagnosis that isn't going to be super common in the US because it is not in the DSM-5. So just so you guys know what you're kind of tuning in for, and we will get started. So what is the difference between trauma, PTSD, and complex trauma or complex PTSD? So trauma, the term trauma, if someone uses the term trauma, it's usually used in a pretty broad sense, right? So people will use the term trauma. Sometimes they're just describing something that has happened to them. Sometimes they're actually describing a diagnosis of something like PTSD or complex PTSD. But the term trauma itself is just a general term describing an emotional response to a terrible event. So, a traumatic event could be any number of things. And you can have trauma or have experienced trauma without necessarily meeting the criteria for a diagnosis of PTSD or complex PTSD. So, trauma can be, like I said, a lot of different things. It could be things like a physical or life threatening event, like domestic abuse, a car accident. It can be psychological trauma. It can be neglect, sexual abuse or assault. It could be medical trauma. It could be community violence, such as gang related violence, interracial violence, police or citizen altercations. It could be school violence or bullying. It could be military trauma, traumatic grief or separation, natural disasters, forced displacement, such as being a refugee. It could be war, terrorism, political violence, and or it could be through being a witness to any of the above traumatic events, even vicariously. Sometimes we can have trauma from hearing about events or being a secondary witness to an event. Term complex trauma can also be used in a more generalized way rather than complex PTSD to describe um, emotional response to experiencing or witnessing prolonged or repeated exposure to traumatic events. So, any of the above events. So, let's get into what is PTSD. So, PTSD is an official diagnosis, a mental health disorder caused by experiencing a traumatic event. A diagnosis of post traumatic stress disorder. These criteria are for adults, adolescents, and children older than 6 years old. And there are some criteria for children 6 years and younger. I won't go into those today. The first criteria is exposure to an actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. So, one of those events that we just talked about, either by directly experiencing the traumatic event, witnessing in person the events that occurred, learning that the traumatic event occurred to a close family member or close friend, and experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to adverse details of the traumatic events. So, in the example of first responders collecting human remains, police officers repeatedly exposed to details of child abuse. Criterion B is the presence of one or more of the following intrusive symptoms associated with the traumatic events beginning after the traumatic event occurred. So these can be recurrent, involuntary, or intrusive distressing memories of the event. For children, this can be repetitive play that centers around themes or aspects of the traumatic event. Recurring distressing dreams in which the content or affect of the dream are related to the traumatic event. For children, this just may be frightening dreams with without recognizable content. So it could just be an increase in distressing dreams. Dissociative reactions, such as flashbacks, in which the individual feels or acts as if the traumatic event were recurring. In children, again, this can be reenactment that occurs in play. Intense or prolonged psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. Marked physiological reactions to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble aspects of the traumatic event. Criterion C is persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the traumatic event. So this could be avoiding memories, thoughts, feelings, or anything closely associated. And this could be avoidance or efforts to avoid external reminders. So avoiding certain places, situations, people, conversations, activities, objects that might arouse these distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings. Criterion D is negative alterations in cognition and mood. So beginning or worsening after the traumatic event. So these could be the inability to remember important aspects of what happened. This is typically called dissociative amnesia. So this would not be because of a head injury, alcohol, or drugs. Persistent or exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about oneself, others, or the world. So they might, after the event, be thinking things like, I'm bad, I can't trust anyone, the world is completely dangerous. Persistent, distorted cognitions about the cause or the consequences of the traumatic event. So often people with PTSD will blame themselves or others for what happened. Persistent negative emotional state. Persistent state of fear, anger, guilt, or shame. Markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities. So they may stop doing things that they normally would. Feelings of detachment or estrangement from others. And persistent inability to experience positive emotions. So they feel like they're unable to be happy or feel satisfied or have loving feelings. Criterion E is marked alterations in arousal and reactivity associated with the traumatic event, beginning or worsening after the traumatic event occurred. So this could be irritable behavior, angry outbursts, could be verbal or physical aggression towards other people or objects, reckless or self-destructive behavior. So sometimes people with PTSD start putting themselves in risky situations that they wouldn't have before. Hypervigilance. So this would be going into situations and being very worried about all the people. Depending on what happened to the person, they might be afraid of men of a certain age, or they're very hypervigilant about locking their home at night, being very hypervigilant in public places. Problems with concentration. So after the event, they just have trouble concentrating on things. Exaggerated startle response. They're very jumpy at things that normally wouldn't have set them off. And sleep disturbances, trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, or restless sleep. Symptoms must be present for more than 1 month after the event. They must cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. I know that was a lot to just throw the DSM at you for post traumatic stress disorder, but I wanted to get that out of the way so that you kind of understand what some of the symptoms are that we're looking for after a traumatic event as to whether someone might be suffering from PTSD. But let's get a little bit into what is complex PTSD and how it differs from PTSD. So, first, I will say that complex PTSD is not currently a DSM diagnosis. And unfortunately, most insurance companies in the US use the DSM for diagnostic criteria. So currently, even if a clinician is aware of what complex PTSD is and it has an understanding of that, if they think that that might be what's going on, they're probably going to use a PTSD diagnosis with some specifiers to kind of clarify what is going on with the client. That being said, the International Classification of Diseases, so the ICD 11, identifies complex PTSD as a separate condition. So that is kind of exciting, I think. So the World Health I cannot talk today, I'm sorry. The World Health Organization recently released the 11th edition of the International Classification of Diseases, and this release was presented at the World Health Assembly on May 25th, 2019. It will be adopted by member states on January 1st, 2022. So, effective January 1st, 2022, complex PTSD will be an official diagnosis in the ICD 11. That is a huge push for this to become a recognized condition. I personally think that's important because the very profile that we see in complex PTSD and the treatment for complex PTSD is quite different typically than that of just PTSD. Because complex PTSD is a relatively recent concept, we're still working on getting it recognized throughout the mental health community. What is complex PTSD? Complex post-traumatic stress disorder is the result of multiple traumatic events occurring over a period of time, often referred to as complex trauma. It's typically interpersonal in nature and typically the result of prolonged and or repeated abuse, neglect, or torture, whether that be physical, emotional, or sexual. It can also be a combination of traumatic events. It could be a combination of various things that happen to you. Causes include multiple incidents of child abuse, particularly child physical abuse and child sexual abuse, prolonged domestic violence, concentration camp experiences, torture, slavery, and campaigns of genocide. So, what are the symptoms of complex PTSD and how do they differ from those of just PTSD? In the ICD 11, 3 symptoms of PTSD criteria must be met, and these include the re experiencing of trauma. They don't line up perfectly, but like I was going through in the DSM, this would be like having recurring dreams, having flashbacks, avoidance of trauma reminders. So, like we talked about, this would be avoiding situations, people, conversations, just avoiding reminders of what happened to them. A heightened sense of threat. This would be the hypervigilance or the startle response. And then, in addition to these 3 symptoms of PTSD, there must also be 3 symptoms of a symptom in each category of 3 disturbances of self-organization, DSO for short. DSO stands for disturbances of self-organization. And you will notice these are also pretty similar to the PTSD diagnosis in the DSM, but I think they look a little bit different in the complex PTSD diagnosis. The three domains for disturbances of self-organization include emotional dysregulation, interpersonal difficulties, and negative self-concept. We'll go into some examples of what those three domains for the complex PTSD diagnosis would be. The complex PTSD diagnosis requires that all PTSD diagnostic criteria are met, including exposure to a traumatic event. If you have a complex PTSD diagnosis, it supersedes the PTSD diagnosis. So you wouldn't get a diagnosis on both. So in emotional dysregulation, this would be just a general difficulty managing emotions. Typically, this is rooted from unexpressed anger or internalized rage resulting from the trauma, which may lead to self-destructive or reckless or risk-taking behaviors, especially in the case of complex trauma, because it is usually interpersonal in nature. There is usually needed to be a survival response of suppressing your own feelings. There's a general difficulty with managing your own emotions after those traumas have occurred. Interpersonal difficulties. Again, because complex PTSD is normally the result of interpersonal trauma, this typically leads to things like persistent difficulty in sustaining relationships or in feeling close to other people, social and interpersonal avoidance. So avoiding other relationships, feeling distant or cut off from other people, and never feeling truly close to another person. I could definitely talk about this topic and how, we can be in relationship with a person when we have complex PTSD, but also we're not really experiencing true intimacy, or we have intimacy blocks, and so on and so forth. This can also look like continuing in really dysfunctional relationships, such as finding future partners that are also abusive and continuing our complex traumatic experiences, or generally needing more of a trauma bond in our relationships rather than a healthy relationship and healthy intimacy. The third symptom category is negative self-concept. So as a result of the trauma, there may be persistent beliefs about oneself as diminished, defeated, worthless, deep and pervasive feelings of shame, guilt, or failure. This can be a fragmented identity, so feeling like you don't fully know yourself, fully understand yourself, or feeling like your personality is kind of in parts, and also feeling like you're contaminated, bad, or evil. Complex PTSD, it is very common to be comorbid with other disorders. Some research has analyzed like the symptoms between complex PTSD, and borderline personality disorder. Many people with borderline personality disorder, or BPD, either have PTSD or meet the diagnostic criteria for complex PTSD. They're still considered a separate disorder because a significant number of people with borderline personality disorder do not meet the criteria for complex PTSD, and vice versa. So they are two separate disorders, but there's a high comorbidity rate, meaning a significant portion of people diagnosed with one will also meet the criteria for diagnosis of the other. People with complex PTSD in general meet more of the criteria for the DSM diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder with dissociative symptoms, depersonalization, derealization. So these are feeling detached or like an outside observer of what's happening to you, feeling like you're kind of in a dream, feeling like you are unreal or your body is unreal or like the world is not real, the world feeling dreamlike, distant, distorted. I wanted to mention that because there is a high comorbid rate with things like dissociative disorders, such as dissociative identity disorder. That kind of goes along with what I mentioned under negative concept, the fragmented identity that can start to go into the realm of a dissociative disorder. So I don't want to ramble because that was pretty much the end of my notes there. Also, comorbidity with things like eating disorders. Obviously, a lot of people are misdiagnosed with things like just generalized anxiety or depression. My name is Vanessa Pruitt. I'm a provisionally licensed mental health practitioner. I work out of Grand Island, Nebraska. So if you are anywhere in Nebraska, you can do telehealth. And I am open for clients. Have a great Friday. Again, any questions or follow-up questions that you need a quick answer to, or you want me to do a follow-up video about, I will do my lives every Friday, and I will see you guys then. Bye.